meeting on the website. Thanks, Charlotte. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is a virtual meeting around Vermont climate action, and it's the culmination of a series of meetings that have happened all month, or the month of April, and now here we are, May 1st. And some of you, and I'm going to do a quick Zoom poll actually in just a moment, some of you may have joined us in these other meetings, whether it's our kickoff virtual meeting or the 7 in-person meetings that we did across the state of Vermont over the last 3 weeks. Today, we're going to do a similar meeting to those. My name's David Plum, and if you haven't met me before, my role here is to facilitate today's conversation. I also facilitate the Vermont Climate Council. Okay, so Charlotte, if you wouldn't mind, my colleague Charlotte Goodman is key on all the tech issues. So if you're having any tech things, let Charlotte know. Charlotte, would you throw up that Zoom poll just for a second? And this is asking, have you participated in any of the things we've done this month, right? On Vermont Climate Action Plan 2025 update. Thanks. I can see a number of you answering. Thank you. Let's just let it run for a second. Have you been to any of the in-person or the kickoff virtual? Just answer that Zoom poll real quick so we can get a sense of who's in the room today. All right, I think we are slowing down. Last chance to answer the Zoom poll that's on your screen. Okay. Charlotte, can you share those results with everybody? Great. A good mix. I love this. Almost 70% of you, this is your first meeting. 30% of you have been to one of the others. I will ask of the 30% a little bit of patience as we do a similar exercise around getting some information on the table and then spending some time having a conversation. All right, let's dive into it. So the first thing I want to do today in this conversation is a little exercise. Now, Charlotte's going to drop in the chat a link. Now, it's okay if the tech is being a little funky with you, but if you click on the link or if you use your phone and use this QR code that's on the screen right now, you will be able to answer this question, which is, what's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the phrase climate action? Okay, so if you click on that little link that's in the chat, the Menti link, or if you know how to use a QR code with your phone, jump in, and I'm going to stop sharing. Alice, you having a hard time with the Menti? Okay. All right, I'm going to stop. And thank you. Yes, you can feel free to use the chat if it's just easier to do that. What is the first word that comes to mind when I say the phrase climate action? Okay. All right. And you can see Charlotte's screen here. This is what you all are saying. All right. I'm just looking at the same time you all are looking. You can see the kinds of words that are getting a little bit bigger, right? These are words like urgent, conservation, necessary, right? There's lots of interesting little words in there as well. Okay, great. I think that's good. I'm going to jump back in. You feel free to keep putting a word in there if you didn't get a chance, and we'll capture that as part of our summary today in the meeting. All right, so what are we going to do? We're going to cover all of that, right? Today, we're going to get into all of that. Let me pull up my agenda in just 1 second here for 1 second. Sorry, I'm a little tech glitch there. There we go. We're back. We're going to have 3 conversations today. The first 2 are going to be quite short, and the third is the one we're really going to invest time in, okay? What are our 3 conversations after we do a little welcome here? The first is, how are we experiencing today in Vermont a changing climate? Okay, so that's our first conversation we're going to do. The second one we're going to do, and we'll just do about 10 minutes on that. The other one we're going to do is what's actually happening today in helping Vermont be more prepared for a changing climate and also to cut Vermont's climate pollution, right? What's going on right now, maybe in your household or in your community, and then the state has a few things to say about this as well. Again, short, 10 minutes max, right? Then we're going to spend most of our time on this final bullet here, where the Vermont Climate Council, which is an entity that was created by the Vermont State Legislature, is in the process of updating Vermont's climate action plan. They made an initial one back in 2001, and now they are mandated by the legislature to update it. And that's why we're here today at this meeting. And we're going to review a bunch of draft priority actions that the council is debating. And they're not in agreement yet. They're still talking about it. And they're very interested in what folks have to say. And that's why we've been going across the state over the last 3-4 weeks and having these conversations. We're going to do this in some smaller groups in Zoom. We're going to break out into 4 groups or 5 groups, and then we'll bring it back in all of us. Okay? Right. Thanks. 2021, not 2001. Thanks, Sophie. Okay, so yeah, that was the climate for the initial climate action plan was in 2021. Okay, that's what we're doing. We're going to be talking with each other today. All of us. I'm looking at, we've got about 74 people on the line right now, particularly in the smaller group, but also in plenary. We're going to be having conversations. And we know that this is an issue in which we have a lot of views, right? As Vermonters, as Americans, we've got a lot of views on this, and that's okay, right? What do I want to see happen today? That folks who want to have a chance to say something, we can share the floor and make sure folks can talk, that we're respectful of different views, right? It's okay to have different views. Just show people the respect you'd want them to show you, right? And also, let's try to stay on topic, right? We've got a climate council that's very eager for input that would help them shape these draft priority recommendations. Let's try to give them as much good input as we can and stay on topic for that. Okay, that's what we got going on. As we get going here, if you'd like to, I'd encourage you to drop in the chat where you are dialing in from today assume in the state of Vermont, where you're dialing in from. Just if you want to say, you know, I'm from Burlington or whatever it is, that would be helpful. Great, yeah. Thanks, everyone. We can see the differences there. Okay, great. All right, here we go. We're going to be doing a little bit of back and forth with that Menti. I promise I won't abuse it too much, but it's a great tool when you've got 70 people on the line to synthesize some information. So we're going to be doing it a couple times. And Charlotte's dropping back in the chat and it keeps running away. But if you can go right back to that same Menti link you went to before, it's going to ask you this question. Now, you can answer with a short phrase this time. The shorter the better, but a short phrase. How are you experiencing a changing climate in Vermont? Type it in quickly. Again, if the Menti thing is not working for you, feel free to use the chat to answer the question. But the Menti is great because we can consolidate what everybody's saying in it and do some quick synthesis. All right, so Charlotte, if you don't want to just keep dropping in the chat the Menti link, that's probably helpful as well. I'm going to drop my screen and Charlotte's going to start to share the kinds of responses that are coming in to this question of how are you experiencing a changing climate in Vermont? Great. You can see the same things I see here. Right. A lot about weather, flooding, extreme events. Ticks. It's expensive. Right. It's hotter. Things are changing with your customers. Interesting. Mold from the wet conditions. Right. Quite a bit around the weather and changing weather. Right. And needing AC now. Yep. It's great. We'll let this roll just for a second more. And then Charlotte's going to press the space bar and it'll do a little bit of a summarizing moment, a little AI moment. We'll see if the gremlins do it well. It's not working, Charlotte?
It's not working right now.
That's interesting. Okay, well, maybe we're saved from AI today. But you can see the threads here, right? A lot about weather being more extreme, the flooding, those kinds of things. Okay. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Sophie Veltrop, who is here from the Climate Action Office. I will also say, are there any climate counselors in attendance today? I didn't quite check. But if you are a member of the Climate Council, if you want to just unmute yourself for 1 second and say hi, that would be great. I just can't see the participant list right now handy.
David, it's
Um,
Liz Miller. I'm here listening in while traveling. Thanks.
awesome. Thanks, Liz. So Liz Miller is here. She's a member of the Climate Council. Anybody else out there? Okay,
I
great.
don't know if he's going to chime in, but I did see that Peter Sterling's on the call as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sophie. Okay, so Sophie, over to you. I'm going to pull the slides back up. Give me 1 second. And Sophie's going to walk us through how the state is trying to track what's happening around a changing climate. So, Sophie, let me turn it over to you.
Sure thing. I also wanted to thank, while we're on the topic of climate counselors, we've got at least one subcommittee member here, and the council does have subcommittees that help with kind of like the first half, the bulk of this progress. So just want to also thank them for their work on this and for being here to listen in. I'm gonna go through how climate change is impacting Vermont and the picture here. I'm going to try and keep it brief because I know about 30% of you have been to one of these sessions before, but want to make sure that we can all start from the same context and then get towards discussion. So when we look at disasters in Vermont, which are increasing in intensity and frequency due to climate change, we're looking at quite a picture here. We now, when we look back at data going back to 2011, and you look at the highest number of federally declared disasters of all the states across the country, Vermont ranks 7. And when you look at the amount of money in disaster assistance received per person, Vermont actually ranks 4th. Now, this is further shown when you look at the counties. So this is all the counties. This is a ranking of all the counties across the entire United States. This is the top 10 counties with the highest disaster count since 2011. And I see a question in the chat of why 2011. That was the, oh no, voice distorted.
Sounds fine to me, Sophie. No, it sounds good to me.
Okay.
So it might just, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that, Carl. And folks should also be able to turn on closed captions. So if that helps with understanding me, you can go to the more 3 dots at the bottom of your screen and select captions.
Yeah.
So hopefully that helps some folks in the audience. So of all the counties across the entire United States, Vermont has 4 counties in the top 10 with the highest disaster count. Now, we heard flooding come up and how people are experiencing climate change. That's a big part of it. But we also know that some of these disasters include ice and wind damage and storms. They do come from different climate impacts. We can go to the next slide. And flooding comes to mind, but we saw some of those other effects in the chat as well, right? Summers are getting hotter. So we need to think about air conditioning now. There's still drought. Our winters are actually the season with the largest change and are getting warmer. And then we're seeing increased precipitation, even when it's not flooding, just overall more precipitation. And that's summer and winter. So this is a helpful visualization. I'll just explain it because it takes a minute to see what's going on here. This is part of this is going to be shown in the climate action plan. Now this is looking forward out to 2050 of what scientists are projecting. And as you go up on the y-axis, that's the amount of confidence that scientists have in their projection. So kind of as something's close to the top, scientists are pretty confident about that projection. Now, when you go left to right on the x-axis, that dotted line in the middle, that's no change at all. And as you go to the right, that's going to be an increase in that type of weather event. As you go to the left, that's going to be a decrease. So we can see that scientists and climatologists are pretty confident that we're going to have more extreme heat, more heavy precipitation, more total annual precipitation, and we're going to be seeing less extreme cold, less annual snowfall. Next slide. Now, switching to thinking about the sources of climate pollution and the causes of climate change, that largely comes from Vermont's energy sources, and we'll talk more about the various sources of climate pollution in a bit. This is just a quick snapshot to think about the energy economy in Vermont. So Vermont spends about $2 billion every year on fossil fuels, and what the picture to the right shows you is that only a quarter of that money actually recirculates in our state's economy, and about 75% of that money is leaving the state. Now, that I point that out because when we spend money on electricity, more than half of money spent on electricity recirculates in the Vermont economy. So we kind of get like a flip there. And switching to electricity is an important strategy in decarbonization, reducing fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions, because a lot of Vermont's electricity comes from clean energy sources and when you look at Vermont's calculations on energy, more than 90% of that is considered either renewable or carbon-free. Now, it's also important to acknowledge that while we all experience the impacts of climate change, the way that those impacts land are going to be different depending on one's situation. And it's important to keep those differences in mind. And as actions are designed, both to mitigate climate change, to reduce its impacts, and to respond to those impacts, it's important to keep communities and people who are on the front lines of those impacts feeling it first and most, and less able to recover from them front of mind in that design, and thus in this plan. So, for example, if one's home is flooded, if you're living on a lower income, have maybe minimal to no savings, it's a lot harder to bounce back from that flooding impact. Another example is if one's livelihood involves working in the outdoors for a living, hotter summers could impact one's ability to work or one's health more so. And you can go to the next one. We've thrown a lot of data at you, and here's just a quote just to add some illustrative example. And I'll let folks read this just as another example of how climate impacts affect different people differently. Thanks. We can go on to the next slide and start to think about our own lives a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. Yeah, so that's a quick walkthrough of how the state is seeing a changing climate. It seems to be aligned with some of the things that you were throwing up as well in the chat or in the Menti. We're trying to move ourselves forward so we can do some small group conversation. However, it would be interesting if folks want to take a moment and think about what are some actions that either in your household or in your community you've been doing to be more prepared for extreme weather, or to reduce your energy costs, right? Which can help reduce energy pollution. Are there things you're doing? So if you want to take a second in the Zoom chat and just say, in my community, blah, 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 or in our house, da, 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 da. If things are happening, it'd be interesting to know what's going on. So feel free, if you want to use the chat just for a moment to do this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what the state has been doing since the Vermont Climate Council made an initial climate action plan 4 years ago. So feel free to drop that in the chat if you want to. I'm going to turn it over to Jane Lazorchak, who is head of the Climate Action Office in the Agency of Natural Resources in Vermont. Jane's going to walk us through what's been happening in Vermont, in state government and legislature, in the state legislature over the last 4 years. And I'll just note there's some interesting stuff happening in the chat. So let me just pause for 1 second. We can read that for a second, right? I'm seeing the people are changing up the way they heat their house, right? Some people are getting electric vehicle, more insulation. I'm just looking at the same thing you all are looking. Great. Cool. Planting trees. Yeah. The municipal upgrades to town buildings, right? Okay. Super. Thanks, everyone. That's really interesting. So, Jane, if I pass this over to you, can you walk us through this timeline of what's happened and a little bit of some of the actions that have been going on in Vermont?
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and thanks to everybody for joining today. So I wanted to first ground us in the law that Vermont passed back in 2020 that provides the architecture and the framework for which this work is being contemplated and put forward right now. And then, as David suggested, give you a little bit of a snapshot of the kind of influence and recommendations that can come from a climate action plan and the work that's advanced since the initial plan was passed almost 4 years ago, back in December of 2021. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in September of 2020. That law took what had been goals on the books for more than a decade, almost 2 decades in Vermont, around cutting our climate pollution. It made those statutory requirements for the state. The first of those requirements was January 1st of this past year. It required us to cut our climate pollution 26% below 2005 levels. 2005 was our largest year as a state for climate pollution, and we've been on a slow trajectory to reducing our emissions ever since then, but acknowledging that more action, more intentional policy intervention and solutions put forward by our legislature and worked on by all of you as homeowners and Vermonters needed to occur. There's also a more aggressive reduction requirement coming in 2030 that requires us to cut our climate pollution roughly in half from 2005 levels. And this plan is really the architecture, the framework, the needs around how we get there. In addition to speaking to climate pollution reduction measures, the Global Warming Solutions Act also has more than 6 other objectives that speak more broadly to the other components of climate action around dealing with the impacts of how we're feeling climate impacts, climate hazards, around building resilience and adaptation in both our natural environment and our communities. And then thinking also about how we invest in those natural systems for the benefits they provide with respect to not only the built environment, but also taking climate pollution out of the air, in other words, sequestration and storage. It also has some narrower objectives around smart growth and the roles of different solutions in meeting multiple objectives around climate action. That law also stood up the Vermont Climate Council, and we want to acknowledge that because the plan that we're discussing today is not in the truest sense, a state plan. It's really a plan that's put up by this independent body that acts as a guidepost to how the state, how municipalities, how the legislature can meet the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So the Vermont Climate Council is an independent body, a 23-member body comprised of both 8 administration officials, so the secretaries and commissioners of agencies that have a firm stake in climate action and solutions. So the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, the Secretary of the Agency of Transportation, Ag, et cetera. And then there's also 15 appointments from the Senate and House that represent different sectors of the Vermont economy that have a stake in thinking about the impacts and solutions around climate action. So the farm and forest sector, the utility sector, environmental organizations, and so on and so forth. And that can be found on our website for the full details. That body put forward the initial climate action plan in what we would argue somewhat of a hurry, a frantic, that was required by law to be adopted. This was also at a time that we were dealing with at-home policies, not able to meet in person, not able to work as closely as we'd like to with all of you around what those solutions should be. And so we have been working pretty much in earnest, not only to advance action, but to think about what those recommendations and solutions would be for this next plan, the plan that we're working on that's due in July 1st of this year. And that's why we called the first plan an initial climate action plan, acknowledging there was more to do and that we would be building the trust and relationships and work needed and expertise to do that for this plan that we're putting forward today. So since 2021, Vermont has made significant progress around climate action. I would argue many of these recommendations put forward were not concepted and put forward in the initial plan, but were bolstered by and spoken to for having that additive benefit of addressing some of the climate solutions needed that I just spoke to, whether it be cutting climate pollution, investing in our natural and working lands, or thinking about climate smart development. And so I want to walk through what we in the Climate Office think of often as the three-legged stool, those three core components of work that really are key to making progress. Yes, we need to cut our climate pollution, and the next slide will talk about measures that we've put in place to do so. But we also have acknowledged, and the climate plan does this strongly, the work to invest in our old forests, our ecosystems for their benefits, and then thinking about climate smart development for the benefits of building resilience and adaptation into our state. So since the initial plan, Vermont has passed some significant laws that were recommendations in the initial climate action plan. First, and key to conserving priority ecosystems and mature forests, were the biodiversity bill, which largely took goals that were put forward by the Biden administration and made those law and set forward a framework for how to implement those in Vermont around the needs around conserving lands for the primary purpose of biodiversity or their ecological functions and values. 30% of Vermont's land by 2030. Vermont is just over 20% conserved right now, and so it sets forward a classification system and a priority plan in advancing further conservation in that space, and then also sets us up to meet a 50% by 2050 requirement. We also made changes to our current use program. The current use program, also commonly called UVA in Vermont, allows private forest land and agricultural land to be taxed at its current use value rather than its development potential. You have to have a minimum acreage for the forestry component. That's 25 undeveloped acres or 27 acres if you have a homestead on the property. Those lands are enrolled and you get a significant tax reduction, but they have historically been put forward as lands to be logged commercially. And over the last decade, there have been exemptions and changes to the current use program that allows flexibility around the silvicultural practices applied to those lands. And most recently, it allowed forests that exemplify old forest characteristics to be enrolled and not cut at all for the values around old forest function. We've also passed two significant laws, one a new law, the Flood Safety Act, and one reform to Vermont's historic Act 250 land use regulation. The first, the Flood Safety Act, looked at taking what had been voluntary flood bylaws that municipalities could adopt, and our agency, ANR, was supporting municipalities in putting forward no development zones in Flood's Way along rivers in harm's way, and that is now going to be implemented as a state regulation. It also, the Flood Safety Act, looked at how we improved our dam safety in Vermont, as well as moved from a no net loss policy around wetlands to a net gain policy for wetlands. And then Act 250, which I think many of folks in Vermont attribute to the rural character and nature of the way our lands are developed, is 50 years old as a law. And we made reforms last year that were also put forward and contemplated in the initial climate action plan that strive to make it easier to develop in downtowns to reduce the burden of regulation, while also increasing conservation and regulation outside of downtowns in those high priority ecosystem areas, so that we're really focused on developing and encouraging housing where we want, close in downtown areas, to make it walkable and livable, while also protecting the outside agricultural and forestry landscape for those added benefits to downtowns. Next slide. Around reducing climate pollution, it would be a fault of us to not reflect on this slide that much of this progress over the last 4 years has been due to the historic federal commitments around different laws that were put forward after the COVID pandemic, and then further since then. So first, Vermont benefited from the American Recovery Act, and then also from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then most finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was specific to climate investments. Those federal funds allowed Vermont and our governor and administration to direct a lot of that funding to cutting climate pollution. Those funds we all knew were a temporary fix for what we need for long-term revenue for investments in this transition. And while we acknowledge the current federal administration is pulling back those funds perhaps faster, we were not naive to the fact that we were going to need to think about financial solutions in this next climate action plan. And you'll have the ability in reviewing some of those recommendations today to be thinking about how we fund this work long term. But because of that funding, Vermont has been able to make significant transitions when we think about how we heat our homes, the way we drive around the landscape, those two largest areas where our climate pollution comes from. And we've been able to now have a friendly competition with Maine, where David is from, around heat pump installations and fuel switching to electricity. Maine has the most number of heat pumps installed, but we are leading the way with most heat pump installations per capita in New England. We also have about 3% of our vehicles in the state are now registered as electric vehicles, or 18,000 electric vehicles registered. And Vermont was able to put forward regulations since the last climate action plan that require an increasing number of electric vehicles to be delivered to Vermont for purchase by Vermonters. And then we've been able to really scale up the number of homes weatherized since the initial climate action plan. If you were looking at a trajectory from that 2024 data, what you'd see is a doubling of weatherization over the last 4 or 5 years as a result of being able to think about how we invest in workforce and how we scale up the amount of money we have to support low income and moderate income weatherization. Next slide. So there's a lot.
Just say, Jane, we're tight on time, so I'll just give you a little flag on that. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's still much to do. And what this graph shows you is that we as a Climate Action Office track through the greenhouse gas inventory, Vermont's emissions. And that data runs a few years behind. And what you show is our most recent inventory was from 2021. And along the dotted lines across is the statutory requirements. And so as I mentioned earlier, the January 1st, 2025 target has come and gone, and this plan is really prospectively looking forward to 2030, and we know significant policies, funding, et cetera, is still needed in order to meet that 2030 emissions reductions target. Next slide. So where you all fit in this process, as I hand it back off to David, is that we sincerely want to hear from you. We have been thinking about how the public weighs into this update to the Climate Action Plan since we kicked it off back in the spring and summer of 2024. We had some public kickoff meetings to invite Vermonters into what the process is with the Climate Council, which has been open and transparent. All of the meetings are public, along with the subcommittees where the recommendations were really conceived before lifted up to the Climate Council. Vermonters have been participating, providing comment. We also had a targeted 8 input sessions back in the fall to help us really think about where action was needed and what the recommendations should be focused on. And then the Climate Council has really been incubating and talking about what the recommendations are. And we're here with all of you, sharing those as draft today, with the intent of summarizing up that feedback and lifting it up to the council as they deliberate and think about what the recommendations are to be included in the final plan adopted on July 1st. And we want to just acknowledge, as I said, that initial climate action plan, we didn't feel like we had enough time to really engage with Vermonters. And we've been really working through the staff here today through Consensus Building Institute and through an intentional focus through Sophie Veltrop as really thinking about how we meet Vermonters where they are and don't just have these kinds of meetings in the time of a plan update, but really meet with Vermonters all throughout the year to hear from you and build trust so that as we have a plan like this coming out, your voices, you feel like you want to engage with us and know that we'll hear from you and modify and try to incorporate your recommendations into the plan. So really appreciate you all being here today. And with that, want to turn it back over to David to introduce you to the recommendations.
Super. Thanks, Jane. Okay. Excellent. So that's some core background. Now, we're about to split up into some smaller groups so we can actually have a discussion with each other. I'm not going to walk through the content of the 54 draft priority actions because that would be deathly slow. What I am going to do is point you to a document that Charlotte just dropped in the chat where all 54 are listed and in sort of bullet summary kind of language. And they're kind of color coded. And the color codes are what you see on the screen here. And they're bucketed up into these 4 buckets. I'm just going to say what the buckets are, and then we're going to have a little time to read on our own before we dive into some discussion. The blue ones, which has a kind of jargony word of cross-sector mitigation, all that cross-sector mitigation means is reducing climate pollution, like reducing emissions. There's 3 big ideas in there around the transportation issues, around buildings and thermal, like how we heat our homes, and then electricity. So those are the components that you'll find in the blue ones. It's all about how we cut our emissions. Hopefully we're saving money when we do it, even if it involves some upfront cost. Okay, so those are the blues. The greens, which are rural resilience and adaptation, they are all about how our communities across the state are better prepared for the kinds of climate realities that we're facing and the weather stuff that you had mentioned earlier in this meeting, right? So you'll see things about planning and preparing and having capacity, and then what do we do with the built environment, making sure the culverts are big enough and that kind of stuff, right? And there's a new section this time which is around public health, because public health is part of the story in this changing climate. In the purpley ones, the ones in the bottom corner here, are about the land. And they're about agriculture and forestry and ecosystems. Okay? And in there, you'll find things about how do we make smart decisions about the way we use the land, whether we're farming or doing forestry or conserving land. How do we do it in ways that don't emit, that actually can sequester carbon, like pull carbon right out of the atmosphere? And how do we support our landscapes, whether it's farmers or foresters or rural economies, in thriving in this new environment that's difficult, right? Finally, there's some pieces about general land use. If you're interested, for instance, around the tensions between renewable energy, say solar, and agricultural land, you'll see a recommendation in the purples about that, about how we get that balance right between supporting renewable energy and supporting our prime agricultural land and our forests. In the yellowy, orangey, somewhat reddy ones up, the cross-cutting pieces are things that are, cut across various pieces of this, whether it's workforce and education stuff, or whether it's our settlement patterns, and Jane mentioned that in the reform to Act 250, like how do we encourage development in areas that reduce the environmental and climate impact? And then there's a recommendation around some financing ideas for how to create some creative finance for this. Okay, I'm just going to say we've been around the state for the last 3 weeks having these conversations. And I just today threw a slide together with some of the colleagues about what are some of the big ideas coming up. This is super drafty. This is not a definitive analysis or anything. It's just sort of like, what are we hearing? For the people who decided to show up to these meetings, what are we hearing? And as a parentheses, this is not a scientific sample of Vermonters. This is folks who decided to come to the meetings. But there's a lot of enthusiasm around cutting emissions, a lot of enthusiasm around workforce development and education. There's enthusiasm around a program that could raise some revenue. It's called Cap and Invest. You'll see it as the #1 action in the blues. And there's other things as well. In terms of things about missing, a lot of questions about how do you fund all this? What does it actually cost? Talks about geothermal networks. Where do we see that? Protection for outdoor workers. And then we've heard a little bit, including in a meeting just last night, we'd like to see more emphasis on the current hazards right now. Like how is Vermont recovering from and preparing from floods right now? And if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, there's been a constant call for a little bit more prioritization or significantly more prioritization. The initial climate action plan was 250 something. We're down to 54 priority actions. Folks were saying, can you give us a top 10? Also try to be specific in language, and let's have some plain language. Okay, so as we break up in our groups here, I'm going to ask you 2 questions in the group. First, we're going to do some reading time. Then we're going to have these 2 questions. What's working? Like what's compelling? And what's urgent feedback for the council? Excuse me. These are the 2 questions we're going to have as we go back. And I'll remind folks of those discussion guidelines. Just be respectful of as we talk, share the floor, stay on topic. All right, so Charlotte's going to send us out into breakout groups, like some smaller groups that will be facilitated by me, Sophie, Jane, my colleague Indra, our colleague Liz Amler. And we'll head out, we'll sit and read that document that Charlotte threw in the chat. We're going to sit and read that document in silence for about 5 minutes. We encourage you to jump to the area that most interests you. You won't be able to read it all. So if you'd like to read about how to cut emissions and what the Climate Council is thinking, jump into the blues. If you want to read about ag and ecosystem and the use of land, jump into the purples, and so on. You won't be able to read it all. So we just encourage you in the 5 minutes we'll have to read, pick your topic and dive on in. I think that's it. Charlotte, am I forgetting anything?
I don't think so. 20-minute timer?
Let's put a 20-minute timer, 5 minutes to read, 15 minutes to have a conversation. We'll come back and we'll continue the conversation right here in the plenary. So go ahead and click on that button that says join. Okay, welcome back, everybody. That can be a little bit of a rupture to get pulled back like that if someone is mid-sentence. Apologies if that happened. I know it can happen. So I hope folks had a good conversation in our group. I loved our conversation. It was really interesting. We probably could have gone even longer. We are going to continue it, though, right now in plenary. However, before we just raise our hands and continue in plenary, I want to do a little synthesis of what happened in the group. And the way we're going to, in the different groups, the way we're going to do it is we're going to go back to our Menti tool. We're going to do it 2 more times. And I apologize if folks are getting a little fed up with the Menti, but it's a really effective way to synthesize things. If you click on the Menti link again that Charlotte just dropped in the chat, it's going to ask you the first of those 2 questions that I set us up for, right? What's most compelling? And so on the basis of what you just spoke about in your small group, it would be great if you just type in a short phrase. Maybe it's changed a little bit from when you first thought about it, but what's most compelling about what you saw when you skimmed through the document? And we'll run that for a second. We'll do the second question of the urgent feedback, hold that thought for a second, and then we'll just open up the mics and have a final discussion here. Once Charlotte starts to see some content come in, there we go. We can share the screen, and maybe this time our little synthesis AI tool will work as well. Okay, so I'm just reading what you all are writing here. Transportation, buildings, education. Simplify and assist the application processes for funding and support. Yeah, I think that's in the Ag and Eco one. Or it might be in the rural resilience, I can't remember. Right, figure out what works. Support the public's health. Financing the goals. Making public transit work. Flood resilient support for municipalities. The most immediate impact ones. The electricity ones in the blues, right? Items 4 and 6, which are about electricity. That opens up the door for everything. No new biomass facilities. Support cap and invest. Cap and invest. Okay, we'll let this run just for a second more.
And David, we have 3 in the chat as well.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Resiliency and affordability, immediate focus on transportation conversion, and then building standards that are actually enforced. Great. Charlotte, how's that spacebar thing working for you today? Not so well.
Doesn't want to work today.
Huh. Oh well. Such is life. Well, let's go forward to the next one. This is the last time we're going to use the Menti, I promise. And urgent feedback for the council, right? The council has a month or so to finish up. What is something you really want them to hear that maybe is a shift of change? I'll give folks a moment. Right, I'll note in the chat as well, craft a plan that meets the Global Warming Solutions Act goals on time. Focus on solar and wind, not biofuels or biomass or natural gas, keeping trees in the ground. Okay. Continue the rural broadband, keep trees, a definition for nature-based solutions, end biomass. Right. Can we think about the priorities that may actually get funded? Focus on fewer actions, make sure they're the big ones. Language access. Right. Focus on the cities and villages that have experienced flooding and need help. Okay. This is really helpful feedback. I appreciate everybody taking the time to write this up. And I know it's sometimes can be frustrating to have to type stuff in. So thank you for doing that. So I think what we want to do in the remaining time, before we tell you a little bit about next steps, is just give a moment here in plenary amongst all of us. If there are things that you don't think were coming out well in that Menti exercise, or that really need to be stated and they haven't really come up, this is a chance to raise your hand and say, you know what, this thing is important as well. So we can do a little bit of that. And again, I just encourage folks to think about this as advice for the council as much as anything, as they're trying to finish up their work. Priscilla, go right ahead, please.
Hey there, I'm the one who mentioned the thing about what will actually be passed by the legislators in terms of funding, because as we just saw yesterday and today, Scott Beck, who happens to be my senator locally, is trying to cut back the budget for some climate action. And I just think, I don't know how to comment on a specific thing, but your plan, as a person very concerned about climate, your plan looks excellent in many ways. But I just don't know what's actually going to get funded. So I feel like if there's any way to discern what has a better chance of actually being implemented.
Thanks, Priscilla. Yeah, and you can see in the Menti as well, like interest in further focusing or further prioritizing. We've heard that repeated in the last few weeks, and that could be a great criteria for them. Okay. Dorothy?
Let's see here. Yes, in the short term, years ago, I was active with the power company that was in Rutland that's now part of Green Mountain Power.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, a great deal of the power coming into Vermont came from Vermont Yankee. No, and then also it came from Hydro-Quebec. We don't have Vermont Yankee anymore. And I'm not sure how much of our power comes from Hydro-Quebec, but with what's happening between us and Canada right now, in the short term, there's possible price increases.
Right.
And the Climate Action Committee organization needs to, in the short term, address the effects of the tariff fight over
Thanks.
electric power.
Thanks, Dorothy. A helpful flag for sure. And indeed, Vermont does buy quite a bit of energy from Hydro-Quebec. Destiny Pierce?
Hi, can you guys hear me okay still?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, thanks. So this was a great plan. One thing I wanted to note that I didn't see here was digital equity on this plan. So that's just, having equitable access to technologies and reliable internet. And I just really wanted to name, how important this is as an EJ issue as well. And I know many people might not think about it as one, but it totally is because, we just cannot fall behind in technology. And like we're trying to organize here on Zoom, but how we saw in the chat, people here and there in the call are struggling to effectively listen and participate in this meeting sometimes because maybe their internet isn't as good. So, like a digital equity plan, it would essentially ensure that people have access to digital technologies and resources, regardless of like their gender, age, ability, location, or economic status. And it's more than about having like access to devices on the internet. It's also like having the skills and knowledge to use them effectively. So it's important for many reasons, like cultural participation. People are really social there, employment, learning, and just access to essential services and information. So I just feel like the lack of digital equity can have very serious consequences right now for people in our communities. For example, I guess without access to those digital resources and skills, people might have trouble accessing certain resources or job opportunities or just vital services people might not know about, and just like limit like just like exacerbating those inequities. So we really need like broad internet access statewide that's affordable. And yeah, I hope that you guys could consider that.
Thanks, Destiny. I appreciate that input. And I know that in previous plans, and I think this is a good reminder that in addition to these priority actions, there are still another 150 or so, almost 200 additional actions. They're part of a suite of things that the council is looking at. And we didn't present them today because there's just so many. And I know that in the past, broadband and access to broadband has been, and technology has been part of that. And maybe if someone knows while we're talking here, they could figure out if that's still in the suite of actions. All right. Mike, Roy, over to you.
Hi. Small piece that was mentioned was about a kind of energy navigator program, sort of helping people who live in Vermont to sort of figure out how to work through this really complicated system and make these really hard choices and figure out what they want to do and how they're going to pay for it. And I don't have a particular solution to that, but I was glad to see that mentioned. And I think I'm involved in a bunch of conversations with various organizations across Vermont. And I do feel like that's a really critical piece. You need lots of other pieces to it, but this part of just connecting residents to solutions and help giving them a path forward is the only way that we're really going to move as quickly as we need to. So I'm really hoping that that'll get a hard look when they're working through what their priorities are.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. You know, and I know it's in there, and I've heard the council talk about it. Yeah. Ronald?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, even though it's not exactly on any of our topics, and very annoys me very much of the complete, almost seems to me complete misuse of units, like mixing up power and energy, and the units that's used, and they misuse them. I don't know whether it's accidentally or deliberately. But as far as the science goes, it's not, a lot of it is not, doesn't make sense. And please use the right units. Power is not energy. Energy is not power. I can get a huge amount of energy from a little AAA battery I shorted out in a millionth of a second. But I can't obviously run the state on it. So be careful. That's a major gripe of mine. Another thing is, I hear all of this about solar energy. I have Powerwall, so I have a record of how much that generates each day and how much energy I use. And anyone with the data or Powerwall has the same record. And some of the numbers I come up with, getting the energy from the sun and that, as the days, I got data I'm willing to share with anybody. Like all week in the winter, and I get maybe 2 kilowatt hours a day. You know, I have the data. I'm willing to share with anybody. Why don't we actually see who's willing, who has that information, and will be willing to share, so we know what is going on with, especially the solar power in the winter. We do live in Vermont. We have, in the middle of winter, we only have 8 hours of sun a day, and it's low. There's nothing you can do about that. So let's be realistic about this. That's one of my biggest, it applies to anything. A major complaint of mine.
Thanks, Ronald. I really appreciate you emphasizing the importance of precision of the use of terminology and also data whenever you can get actual data. That's really helpful. Henry, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Desiree and put some other items related to rural broadband on and how important this is. So I think that, you know, rural broadband will have a major impact in terms of the economics, the economy in the state. You know, that when people can work from home, you know, they don't have to drive in cars, so it affects the transportation sector. You know, smart connected buildings save huge amounts of energy without any physical investment. So I'm urging you to do that, but also realizing that, you know, you have the VCBB that you should be connected with, and you guys should be teaming up together, because, you know, these two things are very compatible and should be included in this plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Dorothy?
Yes, while we have the opportunity, I'd like to go back to the question I asked in the chat about why 2011 was chosen as the beginning of the time span for those statistics. As a mathematician, I know how things can be shown to reflect. 2011 is when Irene came through.
Mm-hmm.
And the time span you picked for the statistics that were shown at the beginning of this process is a 13 or 14-year span. Now, somebody who is just walking in is going to say, why? Why include Irene, and why such an odd, why not a 10-year span, a 20-year span, a 25-year span, a 5-year span? Why not 2005 when something was passed in the legislature?
Dorothy, I think there's an answer. I think Sophie's got an answer for you.
Yeah, thanks, Dorothy. I saw your question back when we were presenting, and I was in the flow, so I couldn't quite answer in the moment. So that I went to this source called Rebuild by Design. They also have this map that is known as like the Atlas of Disaster, but it's got the link in that in the presentation slides, which we can share, and that's the time frame for their data and those images that we wanted to pull and reuse. So it wasn't necessarily sort of like the exact years that we chose, but it was a helpful, like, here's a summary, here's a quick snapshot. And as to why their graphics started at that point, I can't say exactly.
Right.
Aside from that, I know that the effects of climate change are becoming more intense over the past 10 years.
Right. These have been the worst 14 years. Yes.
Yeah.
I've been here in Vermont for 55 years.
You've seen a few things.
Yep. I've seen 155 inches of snow at the Burlington Airport in winter.
Yeah. Yeah.
They used to tell us how much snow was at the stake on Mount Mansfield in feet, not inches.
Hey, you've seen some changes.
But the last 15, 20 years have been exceptional.
Yeah, they sure have.
And we didn't need air conditioning in the summer.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So I'm not seeing more hands, and in the absence of hands, and to be able to finish on time today, I thought I might throw up some next steps here about what's happening. As I've mentioned a couple of times, and first of all, I just want to say thank you all for that input. I saw something in the chat, I think it was from Pike, like, hey, are we capturing all the comments from the breakouts? And we will capture the themes from the breakouts. It's important, if there's really specific comment you'd want to share, I would say, please drop it in the chat or send us an email, just if you have a very specific thing you want to say. We are at the tail end of receiving comments, written comments. That's today. We've been doing this all month, and the Climate Council needs to get a summary tomorrow of all comments. So that's why today's the deadline. They meet on Monday, and we'll be meeting every other week for May and June. Their goal over the next 2 weeks or so is to really dig into all this feedback and understand what might need to change in these draft priority actions. As Jane said, July 1st is the deadline set by the legislature, so the council is really under a time pressure to make that happen. And in the fall, you can expect more things happening around implementation issues. There are other processes that are related to this, such as a resilience implementation strategy that the Climate Action Office is doing together with the Treasurer's Office. So there's other things that are happening. Let me share some resources on the screen, and we will share this deck. We have your emails from your registering for this, and so we can share this deck back to you if you let us use your email. Here's some resources. All this content is on the website of the Climate Action Office, which is climatechangevermont.gov. This is a direct link into the work we're doing right now and all the materials for this. There's a number you can text if you want to join the e-newsletter, and you can also do that on the website. And there's much more information on the website, including a calendar that has all of the meetings of the council that's coming up, and folks are welcome to join. There's always a virtual option, and there always is an in-person option if you want to get there in person. That's all that we wanted to do today, unless Jane or Sophie or Charlotte, I'm forgetting something, or Indra or others. I think that's all we have. And we certainly welcome you all staying engaged and seeing how the council responds to the kinds of input you're providing and that Vermonters across the state have provided all month. So with that, unless Jane or someone else has a final word, I think we can finish up.
Oh, that was great. Thanks so much for everybody being here today.
Excellent. I appreciate the notes in the chat. Thanks for all that. And I really appreciate all the people feeling enthusiastic about this. We're trying to create a space for real constructive interaction. So help us do that. In fact, when you sign off today, Zoom might ask you a question or two about this meeting and how you felt it was and how it could be better. So we'd welcome if you take a moment just to answer those 2 questions. All right, I think that's it. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.